So when you hear the name Jim Henson, odds are good you think of this guy, Kermit the Frog. And it's a great place to start because Kermit is Jim's most famous creation, and it's the one that he himself would even say he was probably most closely affiliated with, the most comfortable Muppet on his arm. But there's a lot more going on with Jim Henson than just Kermit or just the Muppets. I'm Brian J. Jones. I'm Jim Henson's biographer, and I am thrilled to be here in my hometown at the Albuquerque Museum to take you on a brief walk through the Jim Henson Exhibition, Imagination Unlimited. We're going to talk a little bit about some of Jim's most famous projects and some you probably haven't heard of as well. So let's start at the beginning. What was one of the primary components that informed Jim Henson's wonderful creative imagination? It was television. Jim Henson wanted to be on television more than anything in the world. He was fascinated by the technology. He was fascinated by the idea that what you saw there was going on someplace else, and he was going to do whatever it took to be on television. So in the span of about 2 weeks, when he was still in high school, Jim taught himself to build and perform Muppets and got a job working on the local CBS station in Washington, D.C. And that was the beginning of Jim's creative imagination, especially on television. Jim ends up with his own television show while he's a freshman in college at the University of Maryland called Sam and Friends. And this is where Jim develops a lot of the things that would inform the Muppet brand of madness. Ending sketches with explosions, ending sketches with things getting eaten. But more than anything else, Jim does something really remarkable with puppetry on television. He's the first one to figure out a solution hidden in plain sight that you don't need the puppet theater, as we saw in something like Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. Jim's using every side of the TV and having a blast. And this is the beginning of Jim's explosive imagination on public television. So in 1957, based on the success of the Muppets on national television, places like the Jack Paar Show and the Tonight Show, Jim Henson is hired by a Washington, D.C. coffee company called Wilkins Coffee to produce a series of commercials for Wilkins Coffee. So Jim Henson does something very interesting with his Wilkins Coffee commercials. He tries to make people laugh, which was unheard of, especially for a coffee commercial. And what Jim comes up with is 2 Muppet characters to be Muppet pitchmen, the first ever in Muppet history. And who he comes up with here, we see the tan character. This is Wilkins, and Wilkins will drink Wilkins coffee. And here on the right, the red character, this is Wontkins, who won't drink Wilkins coffee. And the name of the game in these Wilkins Coffee commercials is what will it take to get Wontkins to drink Wilkins coffee? And as it turns out, it will take quite a lot. Jim produces these commercials for a number of years, and they're so successful, he ends up using sort of the same basis for selling bread and selling coffee in Boston and selling coffee in Louisiana and all over the country. And it makes Jim Henson a lot of money. The money he's generating from the Wilkins commercials, in fact, are kind of what he begins to build the Muppet Company and the Muppet brand off of. He does commercials for Wilson's Meat, which we can see back here. He does commercials for gas companies. But he's also asked to produce a Muppet for a Canadian dog food company, who he then pulls out a couple of years later to appear on the Jimmy Dean Show. And that's Rolf the dog. Rolf is actually our first nationally famous Muppet. And Rolf appears on Jimmy Dean to be Jimmy's sort of sounding board. And he's sort of this laid-back, homespun, homebody dog that Jim creates. It's also one of our first live hand Muppets. Meaning he's a Muppet where you can pick things up with your hands in these Muppet gloves. So Rolf's a really versatile, really fun character that ends up actually getting more fan mail on the Jimmy Dean Show than Jimmy Dean does himself. And it's a really exciting time in Jim's life, but there's a lot more going on in his New York company. Walk with me over here. So the 1960s is one of my favorite parts of Jim Henson's career because he doesn't know how this entire thing is going to turn out. So in the 1960s, apart from doing the Jimmy Dean Show and those Muppet commercials, Jim Henson has a lot of projects going on, a lot of really interesting, innovative projects, some of which don't go anywhere. But there's a lot of things going on in this period that don't feature Muppets at all. For example, he films a short film called Timepiece. It's about a 7-minute piece with no Muppets at all. And it's Jim writing it, storyboarding it, animating it, starring in it, picking the music for it. And it's a really fascinating piece that ends up getting nominated for an Academy Award. It loses the Academy Award, and Jim typically says he didn't vote for himself, which is probably not true. Another piece he's doing at this time is something called Cyclia. And Cyclia is an adult-themed nightclub that Jim has a lot of really innovative ideas for. One of his problems was the technology didn't exist for a lot of it. He envisioned putting an inflatable dome in a vacant lot and having a translucent dance floor that he would project film on that would sort of throb in time with music. And he would have walls that were made out of broken glass. Here in the museum, you'll see something similar to what Jim had in mind with sort of a fractured wall of glass that the movie's projecting on. really innovative ideas like this, actually nothing ever came out of Cyclade, but he had it on paper for a long time. He was also doing sort of hippie documentaries, something called Youth 68, which again gave Jim the opportunity to play with a lot of the technology on television, which is really what he wanted the most out of the project. He also produces a very avant-garde Twilight Zone-ish sort of production called The Cube, which baffles critics, baffles fans to some extent, but it's one of those things that's really a strong source of conversation in the Muppet and the Jim Henson community. But you'll see a lot of pieces from The Cube here as well, including some of Jim's rough notes for it and some viewer fan mail for it. So of course, the project that ends up taking Jim Henson's time and effort arrives in 1969 with the arrival of Sesame Street and the Children's Television Workshop. Jim loved this project. One of the reasons Jim was attracted to Sesame Street was because it was making television matter. This was at the time when people were calling television the vast wasteland, and Jim loved the idea that they were going to use television to educate children, to teach children basic concepts. One of the ways they got Jim to participate in Sesame Street was they permitted him to do a lot of these short films, some of which you'll see here, featuring numbers and letters and body parts. That was Jim using that advertising capabilities that we'd seen earlier. But of course, Jim also brought the Muppets to Sesame Street. And initially, some of the child psychologists weren't convinced that the puppets could exist with the human beings on Sesame Street, that they needed to remain separated. Of course, what they discovered when they did some of the early test shows, it was that once the Muppets weren't on screen, the children kind of tuned out. So the Muppets are on the street very much for a number of purposes, one of which is to keep the children focused on what's going on Sesame Street. But here's Ernie and Bert, and of course, again, this is Jim's design aesthetic. We have Ernie, who's horizontal, and we have Bert, who's very vertical, which sort of represented Jim Henson and Frank Oz, who performs Bert, their personalities. Jim knew how to push Frank Oz's buttons, and Frank Oz considered himself very buttoned up and uptight. So it was a great combination and makes for some of Sesame Street's best moments. So Sesame Street is sort of Jim's defining project at the end of the 1960s that pulled him off of some of these more experimental projects we saw him doing. So as we enter the 1970s, Jim Henson is finally able to pull off sort of his dream project. He's convinced the Muppets can hold their own in a half-hour variety show series. And remember, Jim has spent a lot of the 60s performing on other people's variety shows. He knows his stuff when it comes to variety shows. So what Jim is finally able to put together by 1976 is a variety show of his very own, which is of course the Muppet Show. The Muppet Show ends up being probably the most famous show on the face of the earth. At one point they joked that they would be claiming an audience larger than the population of the planet was watching it. But here we see Bunsen and Beaker from the Muppet Show, and here again is that design look. Tall and skinny, short and squatty, and of course works spectacularly again every single time. Muppet Show, biggest show around, wins Jim the Emmy Award. It's repeatedly shown in reruns. It's actually shown in the Soviet Union when they weren't showing Western shows. Muppet Show is the game changer. This is the moment that Jim Henson truly becomes the international superstar. So in 1981, Jim Henson does something unprecedented, but also very typical of Jim Henson. He takes the Muppet Show off the air. And one of the reasons he does that is because he wants to concentrate on filmmaking. And more importantly to Jim is world building. The Dark Crystal is a hugely important project to Jim. It really gives us as viewers, as filmgoers, the opportunity to see Jim's artistic mind at work. Everything you see in Dark Crystal is built. It exists. It has heft. It exists in the real world. And this design was very, very important to Jim. And Jim loved immersing himself in that world building. So this is Agra from the Dark Crystal, ends up performed by Frank Oz. A really sort of heavy, earthbound kind of creature, very different than what we've seen with the Muppets. But the Dark Crystal is one of these projects that doesn't really land the way Jim had hoped he would. It certainly did respectable in the theater, but people were a little confused by this. They were missing the Muppets. They didn't quite understand what Jim was trying to do. But when we look at Dark Crystal, let's also look at what else Jim is doing at the exact same time. The other side of the coin, Fraggle Rock. Fraggle Rock is going onto HBO. HBO's first original series is Fraggle Rock. So if you're a fan of Game of Thrones, if you're a fan of Veep, HBO original programming, you can thank the Fraggles who got there first. This, again, is an important project to Jim for a number of reasons. First of all, Jim set out and told his writers, write me a story, create me a television show that will end war. So Fraggle Rock has these very noble ambitions that, again, are very typical of Jim Henson. The other thing about Fraggle Rock is it was sort of the first time Jim was content to turn the performing over to his really talented performers. And Jim would step in to direct episodes every once in a while, but it was the first time Jim was sort of content to light fuse and stand back with Fraggle Rock. In the meantime, while this is going on, Jim's also developing Labyrinth, which is a really ambitious project of his that he loved. And what I always say about Labyrinth is Jim was absolutely right about Labyrinth, but at the wrong time. Didn't do great when it arrived in theaters. Today, it's considered a film classic. So one of the great things about having the Jim Henson exhibit here at the Albuquerque Museum is it really gives us the opportunity to look at Jim Henson's legacy and what his life and what his art mean to film, to television, to animation, to computer-generated imagery, to art, to painting, to sculpture. But here in Albuquerque, we're also about diverse cultures and diverse colors. And if you look around in this exhibit, I think you're going to find that that's exactly what you see out of Jim Henson and his view of the world. Jim at one point said that his biggest ambition in life was to leave the world a better place for his having been there. I think you'll find he did exactly that.